Good evening, this is Derek Chamblee, broadcasting from Chamblee, Atlanta, the next great American city. Battleground Zero, the epicenter of the 2017 civil defense of the United States of America. And it's a beautiful evening in Chamblee, Atlanta. It's winding up on 7 o'clock in the evening, Wednesday, July 12th. 2017, and we're running a series here as a follow-up to our other, once again, Derek Chamblee CyberCitizen Network, following the Trump path, and we're going to go back, we're going to circle back, cyber circle time, to the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump path. Unstoppable. 7 days. March 9th to March 15th, 2016. Secret meetings, not so secret, between Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, these are all one-on-one meetings, Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush and John Kasich. Now, we're picking it up with the stories that broke on the 9th of March, 2016. And when you Google Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, March 9th, 2016, Miami, this is what comes up. CNN.com, Jeb Bush meets with Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, John Kasich. CBS News, Jeb Bush to meet with Cruz, Kasich, and Rubio before Thursday's debate. New York Times, Jeb Bush to meet with 3 candidates, but not Donald Trump, before Florida primary. Washington Post, Jeb Bush to meet with Rubio, Cruz, and Kasich. Slate, Jeb Bush to meet with Cruz, Rubio, Kasich. And it goes on. Now, what occurred in that 7 days? Well, let's back up to what may have been said between Jeb Bush and Rubio, and Jeb Bush and Cruz, and Jeb Bush and Kasich in separate meetings. After the meetings, none of the candidates, it seemed, made much of a comment as to what was discussed in those meetings, and that's why I call them secret meetings, even though the media knew this. Now, keep in mind that on the 20th of February, after placing poorly in South Carolina primary, Jeb Bush suspended his campaign, not ended it. He suspended it, which meant that he could hang on to any delegates he had, which meant that if the convention in July was divided, a brokered convention, and they could stop candidate Donald Trump from getting enough delegates, then the convention could conceivably turn to Jeb Bush. Now, so he withdrew a full 18 days before these meetings. And so the question that the question would be, why is Jeb Bush still in charge here? Why is Jeb Bush marshaling these meetings? Okay, so at the time, these were known as the anti-Trump Republicans. Anyway, so now, back to the Jeb Bush meeting with Marco Rubio. In essence, as early as 2014, since the Bush family and Jeb Bush made Marco Rubio's career in Florida, and they were both both running for the Republican nomination, they made a deal in 2014 that whichever one of them won in Iowa, the other one would support whoever won. And Jeb Bush was even quoted in the local newspapers, the RUBIO series of the Tampa Bay Times, saying that he would back Marco Rubio's bid for the presidency, the nomination, 100% if Rubio finished ahead of him in Iowa. And the question was, from 2014, locally and in Florida, the question was, how in the world both of them could be on the ballot? Is it possible even that they could be on the ballot as candidates for president and vice president from the same state? Would Marco Rubio yield to Jeb Bush? And so this deal that they made was essentially Jeb Bush really wanting the U.S. Senate seat of Marco Rubio. And in one of the debates, you may remember, Jeb Bush said to Marco Rubio, resign from your Senate seat. Problem, the governor of Florida, Rick Scott, Republican governor of Florida, Rick Scott, has his eyes on the 2018 U.S. Senate seat of Bill Nelson, the Democrat. And the governor of Florida, Rick Scott, early on was in the Trump camp. So if Marco Rubio resigns, Governor Rick Scott could either pick himself appoint himself to the vacated Senate seat, or appoint, in essence, he's going to make the appointment to the U.S. Senate seat. Now, the deal in 2014 between Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio was that Jeb Bush would jump out in front fundraising over $100 million and then switch his support, withdraw from the race, drop out, and switch his support to Marco Rubio. And Rubio would, of course, can't appear twice on the ballot, so Rubio had up until June 24th to make a decision on running for re-election. But early on, you may remember, Marco Rubio said he wasn't going to run for re-election. Okay, and so the deal was a switcheroo, where Bush would basically make it look like he was serious about running for president, and then switch his support to Marco Rubio and all the money from the PAC committees and whatnot, because they shared a lot of common donors. As soon as Jeb Bush dropped out of the race, February 20th, 2016, a lot of the Bush donors went immediately over to Marco Rubio. All right, so we've got this deal between Bush and Rubio, and so on March the 9th, Marco Rubio desperately wanted Jeb Bush to endorse him in the upcoming March 15th, Florida, winner-take-all 99-delegate primary. Okay, problem. Ted Cruz had opened up about 10 offices around the state and was aggressively even seeking the Cuban-American voter base that Marco Rubio had in South Florida, because Ted Cruz had Cuban roots, Cuban-American roots. So Ted Cruz was aggressively pursuing the Cuban-American vote, and at any rate, another problem, Jeb Bush waited so long, after roughly the 18th of January, anybody printed on the Florida ballots would be on the ballot March 15th, even if they dropped out of the race. So there was a lot of early vote. There was a lot of vote for Jeb Bush. A lot of vote for Jeb Bush. And so the vote was divided between the anti-Trump Republicans. And so this 7-day period, right at that point, was an emergency for the anti-Trump Republicans, and they're led by Jeb Bush. So he came out of the meeting with Marco Rubio and did not endorse Marco Rubio. Did not endorse Marco Rubio. And at the same time, the Bush family sent Marvin Bush, a brother, to be the in charge of fundraising, a treasurer with the CRUZ campaign. Oh my. And later on, some weeks later, Jeb Bush's son, George Prescott Bush, land commissioner of the state of Texas, endorsed Donald Trump. Now, that happened later. So coming out of that meeting with Rubio, Jeb Bush knows that they're in a lot of trouble March 15th and that he dropped out of the race too late to get his name off the ballot. And at any rate, so now let's move on to the meeting between Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz. So Jeb Bush meets with Ted Cruz and convinces Ted Cruz to back off in Florida. Back off in Florida so that perhaps Marco Rubio can get the win in his home state. And with the promise that the Bush family and the Bush money machine would help Ted Cruz, and he sent his brother Marvin to him at some point. Okay, Marvin Bush. All right. So, at any rate, then arrangements were discussed as well as who should be out front in what particular state, so that they weren't dividing the delegates, so that they could stop Donald Trump. At any rate, the meeting with John Kasich. John Kasich, in February, was considering dropping out of the race. He hadn't won any of the primaries at that point, and by March 9th, it wasn't even certain if Kasich would stay in the race, but he was determined to stay in the race. And also that night, on March 15th, the Ohio primary was winner take all. So Jeb Bush and the Bush family ties go back to Ohio, and Jeb Bush was certainly aware that they had to have that triangle of states, the Jeb Bush triangle. Kasich's Ohio, Cruz's Texas, and Rubio's Florida, which Jeb Bush was sharing with Marco Rubio. Okay, so with Kasich, Jeb Bush gets Cruz to back off in Ohio, and Kasich can win his home state. And that's what happened. March 15th, just 7 days later, Kasich won Ohio, winner take all. Donald Trump wins Florida. March 15th, the turning point. Marco Rubio withdraws from the race. This is Derek Chamblee. Trump path, unstoppable. 7 days, March 9th through March 15th, 2016. The Jeb Bush secret meetings, the Bush Triangle. Rubio, Kasich, Cruz. Thank you very much.